Imagine waking up before dawn in a house that never truly sleeps, not because of noise, not because of chaos, but because of a machine so precisely engineered that every single person inside it had a role, a rank, and a reason to exist before the sun even touched the horizon. That house wasn't a factory, it wasn't a government building, it was someone's home. And depending on where you stood in the social hierarchy of Victorian England, that home was either the most magnificent expression of power you had ever witnessed, or the place where you quietly disappeared into the walls. This is the story of how the great rural estates of the Victorian era actually functioned. And the answer is far more complex, far more brutal, and far more fascinating than anything a period drama has ever dared to show you. Most people who encounter the Victorian country estate do so through romanticized fiction, rolling green hills, elegant dining rooms, women in elaborate gowns gliding across manicured lawns. But there is a crucial detail. What those images consistently erase is the infrastructure required to produce that elegance. The average great estate wasn't just a house, it was a self-contained civilization, a living organism with its own economy, its own hierarchy, its own laws, and its own culture. Some of the largest estates in England employed hundreds of people across thousands of acres, producing food, managing livestock, maintaining roads, operating mills, housing tenants, and projecting political influence across entire counties. The landowner at the top of this structure wasn't merely wealthy. He was, in practical terms, a sovereign. But here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. That sovereign was himself trapped. The estate wasn't just something he owned. It was something that owned him. The pressure to maintain appearances, to employ the right number of servants, to host the right guests during the right seasons, to present the correct image of effortless abundance. All of it demanded constant management, constant spending, and constant performance. The Victorian rural estate was, at its core, a theater, and every person on the property, from the lord of the manor to the lowest scullery maid, was performing a role written long before any of them were born. Understanding how this system worked requires starting not with the grand house itself, but with the land surrounding it. The estate's agricultural operations were the engine that powered everything else. Tenant farmers leased parcels of land from the landowner and paid rent in return. That rent funded the household. It paid the servants, maintained the buildings, financed the London season, and supported the political ambitions that many aristocratic families pursued alongside their rural lives. The relationship between landowner and tenant was never simply transactional. It carried an entire moral framework built on obligation, tradition, and expectation. A good landlord, by Victorian standards, was expected to provide housing, respond to hardship, and invest in improvements. A bad one extracted rent without care and watched his tenants suffer. And that changes everything. The difference between those two approaches defined a family's reputation for generations. And reputation, in the world of the great estate, was everything. It determined who visited, who married into the family, who offered political alliances, and ultimately who survived the brutal economic pressures that began dismantling the old landed order as the 19th century progressed. The estates that thrived understood something crucial that the ones that collapsed never grasped in time. That the machine only kept running when every single part of it was maintained with the same obsessive attention to detail that a general might give to a military campaign. The house itself was the visible heart of the estate, but what most visitors saw was a carefully constructed illusion. The grand entrance hall, the sweeping staircase, the immaculate dining room set for 20 guests. None of it happened by accident, and none of it happened without an army of people working in spaces deliberately designed to be invisible. The architecture of the Victorian Country House was, in a very literal sense, a machine for hiding labor. Separate staircases for servants, basement corridors that allowed staff to move through the entire house without ever crossing paths with the family or their guests. Bells connected by wires running through the walls, pulling staff from distant rooms the moment a finger pressed a button in the drawing room. The system was engineered so that the work of maintaining luxury would never interrupt the experience of enjoying it. At the center of this invisible world stood two figures who held more practical power over daily life than almost anyone else on the property: the butler and the housekeeper. The butler commanded the male staff, managed the wine cellar, oversaw formal service at dinner, and acted as the primary point of contact between the family and the outside world when matters of household business were involved. The housekeeper controlled the female staff, managed the linen, supervised the cleaning schedules, kept the household accounts for domestic supplies, and maintained the physical fabric of the interior with a precision that bordered on obsession. These two individuals rarely interacted directly with the landowner, except in formal circumstances. And yet the entire comfort of the household depended on their competence every single hour of every single day. Below them existed a hierarchy so finely calibrated that a footman's worth could be measured by his height, his appearance, and the quality of his livery. Taller footmen earned higher wages because they looked more impressive flanking a doorway or standing behind a chair at dinner. Ladies' maids occupied a peculiar social position, elevated above ordinary housemaids because of their intimate proximity to the mistress of the house, yet never truly accepted as equals by the family they served. Kitchen maids worked in conditions that would horrify a modern observer, rising before 4 in the morning to light fires, scrubbing floors on hands and knees, and finishing their days long after the family had retired. The scullery maid, at the very bottom of the domestic hierarchy, spent her existence washing dishes, cleaning pots, and performing every task too degrading to assign to anyone above her. What held this system together was not affection, though affection sometimes existed. What held it together was an elaborate code of conduct so deeply internalized that most participants enforced it on themselves without needing to be told. Servants did not speak to family members unless spoken to, they did not use the front entrance, they did not refer to one another by first name in formal contexts, but rather by their position, or, in the case of senior male servants, by surname. They did not express opinions. They did not display emotions. They became, in the performance of their duties, functionally invisible. And the most skilled among them took genuine pride in that invisibility, because mastering it was the only form of professional excellence available to them. Outside the house, the estate's outdoor staff operated with equal complexity. The head gamekeeper managed the shooting grounds, the pheasant populations, the poaching threats, and the elaborate social ritual of the autumn shoot, which was one of the most important events in the Victorian aristocratic calendar. The head gardener commanded a team that maintained kitchen gardens, ornamental gardens, greenhouses, and the parkland itself, producing not only beauty, but a significant portion of the food consumed by the household. These outdoor roles carried their own hierarchies, their own pride, and their own fierce territorial boundaries that would never be crossed without consequence. Here is where the story stops being merely fascinating and starts becoming genuinely uncomfortable. Because the Victorian rural estate was not simply an economic system or a domestic arrangement, it was a mechanism of control so comprehensive that it shaped the inner lives of nearly everyone it touched, not just their working hours, but their ambitions, their relationships, their sense of self, and their understanding of what was possible for a person like them. And as the second half of the 19th century arrived with its railroads and its newspapers and its rising industrial cities, that mechanism began to crack in ways the aristocracy had never anticipated and could not fully understand. The pressure began from multiple directions simultaneously. Agricultural depression hit the landed gentry with particular ferocity during the 1870s and 1880s, when cheaper grain imported from America began flooding British markets and driving down the rents that estates depended upon. Landowners who had borrowed against the assumption of stable income suddenly found themselves unable to service their debts. Estates that had stood for centuries began to be sold off in pieces, the home farms first, then the outlying villages, then eventually the house itself. For families who had defined their identity entirely through their connection to the land, this was not merely financial ruin. It was an existential collapse. The estate had been their purpose, their justification, their proof that they deserved to occupy the position they held in the world. Without it, many of them had nothing. But something equally significant was happening below stairs and beyond the estate boundaries. The servants were changing. The industrial cities were offering wages, independence, and anonymity that domestic service could never match. A young woman who might previously have had no alternative to life as a housemaid could now find work in a textile factory or a department store, earning her own money, living without the suffocating restrictions of service, and building something that resembled an independent life. The supply of willing domestic staff began to contract precisely as the economic pressures on the estates made cutting costs essential. Landowners found themselves in the impossible position of needing more efficiency from a workforce that was increasingly unwilling to accept the old terms. The tenants were shifting too. The agricultural laborers who had formed the human foundation of the rural estate system had endured conditions of extraordinary hardship throughout much of the Victorian period. Low wages, tied cottages that could be taken away with employment, near total dependence on the goodwill of landlords, and working conditions that left bodies broken by middle age. As literacy spread and political awareness grew, as trade union movements began organizing not just in factories but in fields, the deference that the old system had relied upon became something that had to be negotiated rather than assumed. Some landowners adapted. They improved housing, reduced rents during hard times, invested in their communities, and built genuine relationships of mutual respect with the people who worked their land. Those families tended to survive. Others clung to the old posture of absolute authority and discovered that it had lost its power to compel. What makes this period so genuinely gripping is that everyone involved could feel the ground shifting beneath them, but almost nobody could clearly see where it was all heading. The butler who had devoted 30 years to perfecting his craft was serving in a house whose finances were quietly collapsing. The tenant farmer who had worked the same fields as his father and grandfather was watching those fields potentially pass to a stranger. The landowner hosting a magnificent shooting party in October was privately calculating whether he could afford to keep the house heated through January. But here is the point, crucial. The performance of stability was continuing, even as the reality underneath it dissolved. And yet the estate did not simply vanish. That is perhaps the most surprising part of this entire story, and the part that forces a genuine reckoning with what the Victorian rural estate actually was at its deepest level. Because when historians examine what survived and what collapsed, the pattern that emerges is not one of inevitable decline driven purely by economics. It is a pattern shaped by human decisions, human adaptability, and the quiet persistence of something that the system had always contained but rarely acknowledged openly. Genuine community. The estates that endured into the 20th century were almost universally the ones where the relationship between landowner and the people around them had been something more than performance, where the landlord had actually known his tenants by name, not as a social affectation, but as a real practice of engagement, where the housekeeper had been treated as a professional with expertise worth respecting rather than simply a mechanism for executing orders, where the head gardener had been given enough autonomy to take pride in his work rather than simply fulfilling a function. These relationships were not equal. They were never equal. The power differential was enormous and structural, and not something that goodwill alone could dissolve. But within that inequality, genuine human connection had been possible. And where it existed, it created a resilience that pure financial calculation could never manufacture. The estates that collapsed most dramatically were the ones that had reduced every relationship to its transactional minimum, where tenants were seen as revenue sources, servants as replaceable instruments, and the land itself as an asset to be extracted rather than a living system to be stewarded. When the economic pressures arrived, those estates had no reserves of loyalty or goodwill to draw upon. The people who might have worked harder, stayed longer, or found creative solutions to impossible problems simply had no reason to do so. They left, or they waited, or they watched with something that looked uncomfortably like quiet satisfaction as the whole magnificent structure came apart. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, the great rural estate as a functioning total world was already transforming into something different, not disappearing entirely, but losing the density of its internal logic, the completeness of its self-contained universe. The servant hierarchy would continue thinning throughout the Edwardian period and then be devastated by the First World War, when a generation of young men who might have become footmen or under-gardeners instead died in French mud, and the young women who had been their contemporaries discovered during the war years that they were capable of work that nobody had previously imagined offering them. The agricultural system would continue its slow restructuring under the pressure of mechanization and policy changes that made the old tenant model increasingly obsolete. What remained, and what continues to resonate about the Victorian rural estate even now, is the fundamental question it poses about how human beings organize themselves around power, labor, and meaning. Every person within that system, regardless of their position, was searching for dignity within the constraints available to them. The scullery maid who scrubbed the same flagstones every morning before anyone else was awake. The gamekeeper who knew every inch of his woodland with a knowledge more intimate than his employer would ever possess. The landowner who understood that he was not truly the owner of the estate, so much as its temporary custodian, obligated to hand it forward in better condition than he had received it. Each of them was trying to make their existence matter within a structure that was simultaneously enabling and limiting, protecting and crushing, magnificent and deeply unjust. That tension never resolved itself cleanly. It simply transformed into new forms that we are, in ways we do not always recognize, still navigating today.